Well, if you ask the Greeks, they'll say their lenders, including the IMF, have put them through hell over the past few years. And they'll say it was mostly unnecessary. And now we have the IMF's own watchdog biting its owner, accusing it of making mistake after mistake. We'll go to Greece in a moment, where our guest says his country is under financial occupation. But first, this report by Asha Tanner.
After nearly a decade of struggle and pain, the Greek economic tragedy continues. Unemployment remains high and the country's debt remains a priority on the European agenda. But could it all have been avoided? The International Monetary Fund's internal watchdog has released a damning report into the inner workings of the institution. It highlights failures and inadequacies that may have contributed to the European financial crisis over the past decade. And at the heart of the report is the IMF's decision to bail out Europe's economies. The report says the fund failed to foresee the magnitude of risks in Europe before it bailed out Greece and, subsequently, Ireland, Portugal and Cyprus. It also reveals that the fund did not provide enough evidence that a restructuring of Greece's debt in 2010 would have caused major economic problems across Europe. The IMF is also criticised for overestimating growth projections for the Greek economy at the time. But perhaps the most serious finding is that the fund's collaboration with the European Commission may have put IMF staff under political pressure that ultimately affected their judgment. The IMF is accused of major oversight surrounding the Greek bailout, which led to the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history, and Greece defaulting on payments to the fund. The country's GDP has contracted by more than a quarter. Unemployment remains around 25%. And Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras faces an incredibly turbulent political climate. More worryingly for the IMF is the damaging effect the report could have on the fund's reputation, especially among emerging economies. Many developing economies already complain that the fund gives more favourable treatment to European economies, as shown by its mismanaged bailouts.
Whenever the IMF is involved, it is certainly my view that the IMF has to follow its rules, should not bend the rules, and should always be even-handed.
On Friday, an IMF delegation arrived in Cairo to start talks over a potential $12 billion loan to the Egyptian government. But before any new decision is reached, the fund may have to work hard to salvage its worldwide reputation and rebuild bridges within the institution itself. Asha Tanner, TRT World.
Well, we're joined now by our editor-at-large, Copetas in Paris, and by a former Greek ambassador, Leonidas Chrysanthopoulos in Aegean in Greece. Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, thank you for joining us on Money Talks. What does this report mean to you?
Well, it is something, it shows that the IMF has been making mistakes. It has been discredited internationally, but these were mistakes that we, the Greek people, had anticipated from the beginning, because we saw that what they had proposed, along with the European Union, was something that would not have any practical results in creating a better situation for Greece. So, but I don't think that we should start blaming the IMF. I mean, the IMF should immediately correct itself so that we don't have any repetition of country destructions in the future, because Greece has actually been destroyed by these erroneous policies. Okay,
you say your country has been destroyed by these erroneous policies. You don't want to blame anybody. I mean, the watchdog says the IMF didn't really fully explore the possibility of a full bailout. Your country would be in a very different position if the IMF had.
Of course it would, but I think it was the pressure of the lenders that prevented the IMF from restructuring or doing away with the debt. And that was the mistake. But still, even today, the IMF continues to make a mistake. It insists of restructuring the debt, but at the same time, it also insists of having further austerity measures. And the Greek people cannot take any more austerity measures, which also prevents the development of the country.
Sure, we'll come back to that in a moment. Craig, in Paris, I saw you perhaps disagreeing with one of those points. We know pressure, certainly according to the watchdog, came from the European Union. They had to work so closely with them. Talk about the politicization of the IMF.
Well, the report is damaging. The report charges the IMF with overwhelming arrogance and hubris. I mean, the report says that the IMF misled the IMF board of directors. The report goes as far to say that they failed to grasp currency theory. That means they don't know how to add. And they put this problem on a country of 11 million people who now owe over $402 billion in debt, and they're unable to pay it back. Yet Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, is saying that she sees no real reason to develop any new procedures based on what this report says.
Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, I see you there chuckling away in Athens. Tell me, what exactly are you chuckling at?
Well, how right he is. I mean, how right he is in saying these things. I mean, it is. I mean, the arrogance that was shown by the IMF is something that is incomprehensible to me. And we must not forget also that the IMF is a specialized agency of the United Nations. It's not so independent as it acts. Of course, it was created by the agreements of Bretton Woods back in '44. But we must have in mind that human rights have been violated by the austerity program in Greece. And as a specialized agency of the United Nations, the IMF is obliged to respect the human rights agreements and treaties that the UN has signed. There's also the UN special representative.
Excuse me, Matthew. I have to interrupt here. Excuse me, I have to interrupt. The IMF may have signed these agreements, but banks like Goldman Sachs have not. The lenders have not, and this is where the problem is. This report will lead to show that the IMF is well past its sell-by date. Now remember, Mario Draghi, the former ECB boss, he came to the EU from Goldman Sachs. EU Commissioner Jose Barroso just left to go to Goldman Sachs. This whole problem in Greece started back in around 2001, when Goldman Sachs and other big lending banks loaned $2.8 billion to Greece disguised as cross-currency swaps. As the ambassador says, this problem could have been nipped in the bud in 2010, but the lenders wouldn't allow them. It's the lenders and the politicians in Brussels who control this, not the IMF.
Okay, so the IMF is supposed to be looking out for the interest of its member countries, in this case Greece. They're supposed to be promoting growth, high employment and so on. They failed in that. Where do you think their real loyalty lies? Was it with the global financial system or was it with Greece, Craig?
It was the global financial system, because had they done the right thing and had they known how to add and subtract and divide and multiply, they could have, in 2010, when the debt was much lower, they could have gone in, and I forget what it was then, the ambassador might remember, and say, okay, look, let's cut this down to a figure that your country can deal with. And instead of doing that, 121, okay, now it's 402 billion and rising. If they had cut half of that, half of that back in 2010, they could have, Greece could have handled it, but they didn't, because the lenders wanted to get the interest on the principal.
Just briefly going back to Mr. Chrysanthopoulos for one last answer. Christine Lagarde is saying in her riposte, overall, the conclusion I draw is that the fund's involvement in the euro area crisis has been a qualified success.
It's totally wrong. It's totally wrong, and she's acting in a hypocritical way, because Greece has been destroyed by these measures, which had been taken with the EU, with the Eurozone members, and with the Greek governments, who we don't understand why they had agreed to follow this process, which has, as I said before, it has destroyed my country.
Mr. Chrysanthopoulos and Craig Copetas, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us on Money Talks.